Good evening, everyone. So today I've already received greetings. How would I be starting the class? You are already prepared beforehand. I've received a lot of greetings just before the start of the session. That's really nice to see. Okay, so we'll be completing our chapter 7, Audit Sampling today. And I hope all queries were cleared in the previous session. If there's still any, you can get them cleared today itself. So let's start with session 2, Audit Sampling. Okay. So we left at the part of sampling process. We covered till sampling risk. Now, today we'll be starting with the sampling process. And I told you this is the last part, the more detailed part. How is sampling carried out? And here we have the steps. So, in the first step, we have to take consideration of our sample. How do we design the sample? What factors do we keep in mind? What are the auditor's considerations while designing a sample? What should the sample consist of? How should my sample look like? Interpolation and extrapolation are statistical terms. Interpolation and extrapolation are statistical terms, right? So, if I tell you exactly, interpolation is something to find a value, something within the data, and extrapolate is something find outside of data, just project it. Sample design. So keeping some factors in mind, we design our sample. Then afterwards, we have to consider what should be the size of the sample. Too big, too large, what should be the number of the samples we need to extract from the data from the population. And further, the sample selection methods. Random, block, haphazard, all methods we'll be covering today. So we'll be designing our sample. We'll be taking into consideration what should be the size of the sample and what methods can we use to select the sample out of the population, right? Then we'll carry out our audit procedures on the samples selected. So these first three steps, 1, 2, 3, these are related to picking samples from the population. Designing of the sample, size of the sample, and selecting the sample using different methods. Once the sample is selected, now is our time, our work, carry out the audit procedures on the selected sample. In the next step, we'll see the nature and cause of deviation and misstatement. If there are any deviations from what should have been the original position, the original call, and if there are any misstatements, we'll consider their nature and deviations. Then, as per the results obtained on the sample, we will project it to the whole population and finally evaluate the results based upon audit sampling. So let's move ahead. This was the sampling process. First, it is for which sample we are talking about, this TOD or TUC. What is TOD or TUC, Saurabh? I don't understand. What is TOD or TUC? Acha, test of details or test of controls? आगे तो बढ़ने दो भाई. Let me move ahead. We'll be covering both TOD and TUC. Okay. So the first step is sample design. There are some considerations which the auditor has to keep in mind while selecting a sample. So what are those considerations? The first consideration, the purpose of his audit procedures. The auditor should have a clear understanding what is a deviation, not literally in his case. What would constitute a deviation and what would constitute a misstatement? Deviation from what things had to be, what facts and figures had to be, and actually what they are. That is called deviation. So the level of deviation, tolerable, we read about tolerable level of deviation, tolerable level of misstatement in the previous sessions. The auditor needs to develop a clear understanding what would be his tolerable level of deviation or misstatements, so that only those conditions that are relevant to the purpose of the audit are included in evaluation of deviations or projection of misstatements. So we have found a deviation using audit sampling, and we have found misstatements. So we should be, as an auditor, clear, have clarity as per our audit procedures, what is actually a deviation and what is actually a misstatement for specifically our audit program. It's fine, Saurabh. It's fine. Um so the purpose of audit procedures. Next, the factor. So the auditor needs to be very much clear. I have to apply audit procedures during my audit using sampling technique. What would be the purpose of my audit procedures? While applying those procedures on the samples I'll be extracting from the population, I should have conceptual clarity that yes, I'm going to apply my procedures and this is my tolerable level of deviation, this is my tolerable level of misstatement, so that I can concentrate mainly only on those deviations or misstatements that cross those levels. Now, the characteristics of the population from which the sample will be drawn. We have discussed the what population characteristics this population should carry: appropriateness, completeness, reliability, right? So, auditor may use stratification or value weighted selection procedures as per the case. We'll come to it in the next slides to come. In one or two slides, we'll come to it. What is stratification or value weight selection basis? Okay. So auditor needs to understand the characteristics of the population on from that population he is going to extract samples and apply his audit procedures. So he should know the target. He should be well versed known with the target. What are the characteristics of the target from which he'll be extracting the samples and carrying out his audit procedure. So in the case of test of controls, or as I have come to know about it from Saurabh today, TOC, for test of controls, so what were the controls? The internal controls in the organization, within the organization, and we test those controls, whether they are weak or strong. So for test of control, the auditor makes an assessment of the expected rate of deviation based on his understanding of the relevant controls or on the examination of a small number of items. So controls, how are checks issued, how are accounting entries made, how is delivery of goods received, the number of CCTV cameras, the basis of entry into the factory building, the basis of entry into the server room, the locker room, financial controls as well as non-financial controls. So for testing them, the auditor makes an assessment. What could be the expected rate of deviation based upon his professional judgment and understanding of the client or he may carry out small tests on some of the controls or on the examination of a small number of items from the population. This assessment is made in order to design an audit sample, just to design an audit sample and determine the sample size. For example, as an auditor, I went and I checked all the CCTV cameras and I found more than 50% of the cameras are not working. So I would design my audit sample as far as I would be auditing the controls related to physical and IT security. My sample would definitely contain, one of the samples would be from CCTV cameras, and the sample size would definitely be big, because I have found that the controls related to the design of CCTV cameras, it is good. The client has installed required number of CCTV cameras in the premises, but their implementation, they are not working. Most of them are not working. In the same way, there could be other flaws, other problems, deficiencies in internal control. So accordingly, I'll design my sample to include those deficiencies. I might not have checked them, but I've got an understanding that such kind of deficiencies would be there in other areas as well. So I'll frame my sample size and design it accordingly. For example, if the expected rate of deviation is unacceptably high, I had said that, okay, if 10% of the cameras are not working, it would be good. It's fine. A normal wear and tear, it's fine. But the expected rate of deviation, I found that 50% of the cameras are not working. My expectations from the client with respect to deficiencies in other areas has got higher. I'm expecting there would be flaws, there would be deficiencies in other areas as well. So my expected rate of deviation is high, and that is not acceptable to me, because as far as my opinion is concerned, this is not good. I cannot accept it. So my expected rate of deviation, on the basis of understanding of the client, or as a result of the small tests I carried out, my expected rate of deviation is unacceptably high. So I would say the auditor will normally decide not to perform tests of controls. He'll carry out 100% checking. For test of details further, the auditor makes an assessment on details is what? Transactional level entries, an assessment of the expected misstatement in the population. If expected misstatement is high, I've found a lot of entries, a lot of account balances, they are not proper. So my expected misstatement level is high, because just checking a few of the transactions, I found there are a lot of flaws, lot of deficiencies. So I expect that misstatements to be high in other areas as well. So my expected misstatement is high, then 100% examination I would definitely go for, or I will use a large sample size while performing test of details. So the purpose of audit procedures and the characteristics of the population from which the sample is drawn. Ojasvi, please repeat this question at the end of the session today. This is a good question. The answer would be helpful for all. The discussion would be helpful for all. So I would like if you could quote this question or ask me this query at the end of the session today. Okay, I'll definitely take up your query. Ojasvi, Mr. Ojasvi Singhal. Okay. So the third factor, to determine a sample size, so we have to extract a sample with a proper size, which should be sufficient enough to reduce sampling risk to an acceptably low level. So that the sample size should not be that small, our sampling risk goes higher. And it should not be that big that we are carrying out almost 100% of the checking. So it should be sufficient enough so that our sampling risk is acceptably low. What was the sampling risk? That the results obtained from the sample do not match with the results that would have been obtained from the population had our audit procedures been applied on the whole population. Okay, so for this purpose, we need to consider as an auditor the specific purpose to be achieved and various audit procedures that are likely to be carried out by us to achieve that purpose. What kind of evidences are we seeking? What kind of evidences do we seek? And again, the same thing, the possible deviation or misstatement conditions. We have to fulfill the requirements of SA 500 as well. Audit evidence, we did it in the previous session. SA 530 complements SA 500. So, collection of audit evidences. SA 500 tells us that audit sampling is one of the methods to use while carrying out your audit procedures and gathering audit evidences. So when performing audit sampling, the auditor performs audit procedures, to obtain evidence that the population from which the audit sample is drawn is completeness of the population. We need evidences with respect to the completeness of the population. That we have extracted a sample of adequate and sufficient size from the complete population. Now, the last factor, we have to select the items in such a manner that each sampling unit in the population has an equal chance of selection, such that sample should corroborate to the population. Sample should be representative of the population. And for this, we use sample selection methods, which are random selection, systematic selection, and haphazard selection. Will be covering them up in the parts to come. So these are 4 factors which an auditor needs to consider while starting the sampling process. Okay. Now, coming to while designing samples, we use these 2 types of methods: stratification or value-weighted selection. Stratification or value-weighted selection. So stratification, we already covered a bit of stratification in the previous session, now in detail. So what is stratification? We divide the population into discrete subpopulations. What was that? Categorizing the population into subcategories, which have identifying characteristics. So I told you that the population has to be divided into further groups having homogeneous, uniform characteristics. This is called stratification. So each further subgroup or subpopulation is called as stratum. And the components or units under those subpopulations are referred to as strata. So we have a population of sundry debtors, right? We have a population of sundry debtors, accounts receivable. We divide them on the basis of age: 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. Further, the components, the individual account balances of each stratum are known as strata. Very simple. Another way to understand stratification. Stratification means dividing heterogeneous population. Dividing heterogeneous population having its elements carrying different characteristics into homogeneous subpopulation. For example, there are people over here, many of you are attending this session, so you are all the population. And I'll divide you. Let us take the criteria to be your date of birth. So somebody would have been born in January, February, March, April, right? 12 months. And I ask you, let us divide you on the basis of your date of birth. So I'll divide you in 4 groups on the basis of quarters. People born in first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. So I've divided the heterogeneous population into homogeneous having similar characteristics. So the people belonging to the first quarter, that simple characteristic would be, right? They would be falling in the first category, having similar characteristics of being born in the first quarter, January, February, or March. Further, they are the strata. You are the strata. People belonging to the first quarter, they are the strata. What is the stratum? Group whose components have their birth dates in the first quarter. So we divide the heterogeneous population into homogeneous groups, and samples are drawn from such homogeneous groups. So what do? We apply our audit procedures on this subpopulation. On strata, in the stratum, we derive results from each stratum and further try to derive the results obtained from all the stratum. First quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. Different results, we will club them. And then we'll have results for the whole population. So we categorize and then we project the results on the whole population. Okay. So what does it say? Audit efficiency may be improved if the auditor stratifies a population by dividing it into discrete means whole number subpopulations, which have identifying characteristics. Discrete means different from each other, which can be counted properly. What is the objective of stratification? The objective of stratification is to reduce the differentiation, variability of items, the variation between the items. If we extract a sample as it is, there could be variations in the sample itself. If there is so much variation in the sample itself, how can we project the results to the population? So to reduce that variability, we classify them into different groups on the basis of common parameters. And only then we'll be able to reduce our sample size without increasing our sampling risk. So objective is to reduce the variability in items within each stratum so that sample size could be reduced and without increasing sampling risk, because that particular stratum will have similar characteristics. So whatever sample size as per our understanding and study we choose, it will be a representative of the whole stratum. There won't be any deviations, or if there are any, they would be quite minor. When performing test of details, so you first need to be very well be versed with these terms, test of controls and test of details. We have reiterated them time and again. Test of controls, I've already told you, auditor carries out the test of controls, test them whether they are working and operating, designed and operating effectively or not, efficiently and effectively. And test of details is at the financial statement level, the facts and figures in the books, data. So when we perform test of details, when data is there, financial statements are there, obviously money would play an important part. So when performing test of details, the population is often stratified by monetary value, on the basis of monetary value. each sample will be drawn from each stratum tanu, and sampling process will be carried out on strata. We need to understand population getting divided into stratum. Stratum further has strata. So strata is the smallest unit on which sampling is done. Stratum is basically the sample from where sample you draw. A subcategory from which you draw the sample. You cannot draw a sample or extract a sample directly from the population. First, you need to adjust your population. So you divide your population into homogeneous groups, each group having similar characteristics. Then you extract or draw samples from those groups. Ultimately, you are extracting sample from the population itself, and the elements of those groups or stratum are known as strata on which you apply your audit procedure. So when performing test of details, population is stratified by monetary value. Stratified means divided. This allows greater audit effort to be directed to the larger value items. Because if we are stratifying them on the basis of monetary value, we'll be able to devote our attention and time towards large value items. Because those stratum, which is having large value items, will devote our attention more towards it. Because these items may contain the greatest potential misstatement in terms of overstatement. Similarly, a population may be stratified according to a particular characteristics. For test of details, that particular characteristics was monetary value. In other cases, we can take up other characteristics as well that indicate a higher risk of misstatement. For example, while testing the allowance for doubtful accounts, provision for doubtful debts and all, in the valuation of accounts receivable, balances may be stratified by age. So you are providing for doubtful debts while valuing your accounts receivable, sundry debtors. We usually, what do? We deduct that provision from the debtors. We create a provision and we deduct debt from the debtors in the balance sheet. So what can we do? We can stratify them on the basis of age. So age over here doesn't mean, we have already covered it, who is 60 years, who is 70 years, and who is 80 years, which of our debtors is a senior citizen. No. Age here means how long have these debtors been outstanding at the same value. So we may divide them on the basis of age. This is just an example. So how do we work with stratification, right? Just understand this process. What have we done? Population, dividing the population into stratum, and then applying our audit procedures related to sampling on the strata. We obtain our results. The results of audit procedures, applied to a sample of items within a stratum. So this sample of items is strata. Within a stratum can only be projected to the items that make up that stratum. So at initial level, at the first level, you won't project the results obtained from within a stratum. So this is the whole population. We divide it into stratum. This is stratum 1, this is stratum 2, this is stratum 3, and this is stratum 4. Okay. So the result I have obtained from stratum 1 items. This is my first stratum. I have extracted a sample from here. I have extracted a sample from here, the first stratum, right? This is my whole population. This is my whole population. I divided it into stratum. From first stratum, I carried out a sample. I applied my audit procedures on this sample. Now the results I have obtained over here I can project those results. Projection means to assume that the same results would be obtained from the whole stratum. Now, the results I have obtained over here, the sample obtained from this stratum, I cannot project these results on the whole population. No, I can only project the results to the homogeneous group, the stratum from which I had obtained the sample. What is the first point saying is, yes, similar to the age of humanity, right? So to draw a conclusion on the entire population, the auditor will need to consider the risk of material misstatement in relation to whatever strata make up the entire population. We cannot directly go to the entire population, directly jumping to the highest level. We have to go step by step. So first of all, what do? We have divided the whole population into different stratums, stratum 1, stratum 2, stratum 3, stratum 4. All these stratum have strata in them. For example, this is our accounts receivable. This is one category, this is second category, this is third category, this is fourth category. 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. So I'll obtain some of the strata. Strata would be debtors, list of debtors from the first stratum, 3 months. And apply my audit procedures. What audit procedures I apply on the account receivables, sundry debtors, I'll apply my audit procedures. And I'll project the result of the sample drawn from this 3 months category only to this category. Another sample I would be drawing from the second category, would apply my procedures on that. Third category, 9 months, would apply my procedures on that. Fourth category, fourth sample, I will apply procedures over here. All the samples might yield different results as per their category or stratum. So sample drawn from each stratum, we can project the results from those samples to that stratum, but not to the whole population. To project the results to the whole population, we will add the effect of all these samples. We will add the effect of all these samples to come to a conclusion for the whole population. Right? Mohammed, it could be objective as well as subjective, depends upon the auditor. It is usually subjective. Yes. So sample is taken from the stratum, right? Sample is taken from the stratum. The results obtained from the sample would be projected on the stratum only. Different samples taken from different stratum. Different results obtained. In our case, there were 4 stratum. So we would have derived 4 or 8 samples, 2 samples from each stratum. 1 sample from each stratum. There could be 4, there could be 8, right? 4, 8. Any number of samples would have derived from each stratum. So whatever results we obtained from such samples, we can apply that only to that particular stratum. So the results of all the 4 or all the 8 samples, we will club them, and then that will give us a result for the whole population. Further, the results of samples from the units drawn under each subpopulation are projected to that respective stratum. In order to draw an opinion on the overall population, the auditor needs to combine the results of all the stratum to check for possible deviation or risk of material misstatement. And then finally, projected misstatements of each stratum. So misstatements are found at the lowest level, stratum level. Now all those misstatements would be combined And we will say these are the misstatements in the population account balances or classes of transactions which form up the test of details. So we evaluate the results of each sample, apply those results to the stratum, find projected misstatements from each stratum. Find misstatements. Misstatements obtained from sample are projected upon the stratum, and the misstatements of the stratum are projected to the whole population by combining the misstatements of every stratum of the population. So this is how stratification is done. For example, 20% of the items in a population may make up 90% of the value of an account balance. The auditor may decide to examine a sample of these items. So the auditor evaluates the result of this sample and reaches a conclusion on the 90% of value separately from the remaining 10%, because the auditor will say, in terms of monetary value, I have examined 90% of the transaction. And that the result might be different from the remaining 10%. For that remaining 10%, I'll draw another sample to carry out my audit procedures. And if I found that the other 10% is immaterial, this particular observation of the 90%, I'll project it to the whole population of 100%. But if I find the other 10% to be material also, I'll extract a sample from that 10% as well and carry out my audit procedures on that particular stratum as well, and combine the results of 90% stratum and 10% stratum to project it on the whole population. This was stratification. Value weighted selection is very simple. You categorize, you divide your population on the basis of monetary value. So debtors from the value of groups less than 1 lakh, 1 lakh to 10 lakh, 10 lakh to 50 lakh, 50 lakh to 1 crore. So on the basis of monetary value, you might find the debtors less than 1 lakh or debtors less than 10 lakh need not be checked, considering in mind the volume of operations of the organization. So when performing test of details, it may be efficient to identify the sampling unit as individual monetary units. So on the basis of monetary value, we give value. Like you might have read about the ABC method: high value items, moderate value items, and low value items. It is the same thing. Categorizing your stock, the ABC analysis. What does it say? In costing, you might have read about it, or in finance, economics, ABC analysis. A category is the most valued. Like in the case of a jeweler, gold would fall in A category, gold, silver. Gold would fall in the A category. B category would have jewelry or precious metals which have moderate value. C category would be items having lowest value. So we've read about it that A category is highest in value, lowest in quantity. B category is moderate in value, moderate in quantity, and C category is, the C group is lowest in value but highest in the terms of quantity. In the same way, value weighted selection. Now we select specific monetary units from within the population, like the debtors, the accounts receivable balance. We may examine the particular items like individual balances of the debtors. So in the case of value weighted selection, we have an advantage. What is that advantage? We can concentrate our efforts more on larger value items. Like we are auditing the client who is a jeweler. So we'll definitely apply value weighted selection. Our sample size might be small, but that would be covering the larger value items. So we can use this approach in conjunction. In conjunction means in combination with the systematic method of sample selection, and we get the best results, the most efficient results when we use random selection. We'll be covering what is random selection in part to come, right? And the results we obtain by applying our audit procedures to the samples extracted on the basis of value weighted selections, the results would be in monetary amounts, because we have chosen our sample, the stratum and the strata, on the basis of monetary amounts only. Yes, right, Ajasvi. You give more importance to those chapters which are high, which carry higher value in terms of coming in the exams, being asked in the exams. So that is sample design. So in sample design, what did we cover? We covered the considerations to be taken care of by the auditor, and further, how do you design the sample on the basis of stratification and value weighted selections. So that was sample design, how to design the sample. Or you can design it on the basis of value, or you can stratify it on the basis of, stratify means dividing it, categorizing it on the basis of heterogeneous, homogeneous characters. Okay, Pooja, like stratification on the basis of homogeneous characters. For example, I give you the example of birthdays. For example, okay, the whole population, I would divide you on the basis of your attempt. Students who have attempt in May 22, students who have attempt in November 22, students from the north, from the south, from east, from west, north, south, east, west. Any kind of parameter, any kind of criteria you can take up to divide your population, but that criteria should be homogeneous. Strata belonging to each stratum should have almost same characteristics. Only then you can be very much assured of the sample you draw from that stratum that it would be okay. It would be applicable for the whole stratum. It is like dividing your whole syllabus into parts. You divide your whole syllabus into 10 parts, right? And from that 10 parts, you schedule your study accordingly. Okay, in the first 10 days, we'll do this, or in the first week, we'll do this. Second week, we'll do second part. Third week, we'll do third part. Fourth week, we'll do fourth part. How do you get to know that where you are prepared for the exam or not? If you are confident in all the four parts, you will club the results of all the four parts. Yes, first part completed, second part completed, third part completed, fourth part completed. Now club. I'm ready for the whole syllabus test. So you divide your audit into four parts. You prepare one part and take self-test of that one part. Revise questions from the MTP, RTP attempt questions relating to that part from RTPs or MTPs. Then you do that with the same second part, third part, fourth part. Each part is a stratum. And the chapters in that particular part are the strata. You apply your procedures on the strata. What do? You learn, you practice. And then you revise part-wise, and further you combine all the parts. And then you say, I'm ready for the complete whole syllabus mock test. So that syllabus is your population. I hope the concept of stratification is clear now to everyone. So now, after designing the sample with the help of stratification on the basis of valuing transactions, we come to sample size. What should be the size of our sample? A bit small, moderate, large. So some factors we definitely need to consider. The auditor shall determine a sample size sufficient to reduce sampling risk to an acceptably low level. Very important. Our sample size should be sufficient to cover enough, that much of the population's part, so that our sampling risk is mitigated to the lowest level. We cannot afford a situation where we have worked upon a sample and the population might give different results. Okay? The level of sampling risk that the auditor is willing to accept affects the sample size required. Now, this is subjective. This will vary from auditor to auditor. On the basis of his professional judgment and experience, he would set up a level of sampling risk. It is usually in the terms of percentage, that whatever results I've received from the sample, and if I project the results on the population, so what could be the difference, the sampling error that could I get? What was the sampling error? The result we obtained from the sample and the result we obtained from the population, they were different. So while learning and revising the chapter 6, 7, automated environment, audit sampling, when I was doing the chapter, this you could relate it to yourself. This is the most common issue among you people. So while I'm doing the chapter, I remember everything. Once I'm done with the syllabus, now I try to attempt question from the chapter of sampling or automated environment. I tend to forget. So what is that? Forgetting error? Retention error? This is what happens with sampling error. What results I've obtained from the sample, if I apply those procedures on the population just on a trial basis, testing basis, whether my sample is giving the exact results, there could be sampling error. The population might not give that result. If my sample has a misstatement level of 2%, my population might have a misstatement level of 5%. That 3% is sampling error. So the level of sampling risk that as an auditor, I'm willing to accept, it is fine. It is normal. It is genuine. Like normal loss, abnormal loss when costing. The same way, this is normal in this kind of industry. This kind of sampling risk will always be there. So it will also affect my sample size. If my sampling risk, the level of sampling risk, let us come to the next part, the very important part. The lower the risk the auditor is willing to accept, that is, the auditor is following a conservative approach. You see, at no cost, the sampling risk should be any higher. I want the lowest possible sampling risk. So this is a conservative approach. He doesn't want to take any risk. So instead of checking 100% transactions, what would that auditor do? He would increase his sample size. He will include more strata. He would include more strata in the sample. More the strata, more the elements in the sample, larger its size. So the greater would be the sample size if I am following a conservative approach, that my acceptable level of sampling risk is quite low. So we can also use mathematical or statistical techniques to determine the sample size. So if there are similar circumstances, these factors would affect the sample size. whether we choose statistical or non-statistical approach, because this is not about the approach. This is about how do you design and pick your sample. Now we come to an important part. Factors that influence the sample size for test of controls and test of details. So two types of test an auditor is usually concerned with. The auditor has to test controls and the auditor has to test details. If the controls are found to be weak, the auditor knows that while carrying out the audit at the detailed level, he has to be very conservative. If the controls are found to be good enough, strong, the auditor understands if they have maintained controls so good, so strong, test of details will also yield strong results. They would be maintaining good financials, good approach towards the financials. So, if we are testing controls in the organization and we test controls by extracting samples, so what factors would influence the sample size for testing controls? First, when there is an increase in the extent to which the auditor's risk assessment takes into account relevant controls. Auditor has carried out an assessment of the risks and auditor has assessed risk by taking into account many controls. The more assurance the auditor intends to obtain from the operating effectiveness of controls, the lower would be the auditor's assessment of risk of material misstatement and the larger the sample size. So auditor requires more assurance with respect to the operating effectiveness of controls. He requires more assurance. So his assessment of the risk of material misstatement will be lower. And ultimately, he will go for a larger sample size. So inversely proportional. More assurance, I'll not go for smaller size or directly proportional. More assurance, larger the sample size. Directly proportional, not inversely, directly. When his assessment at the risk of material statement at the assertion level includes an expectation of the operating effectiveness of controls, auditor has to perform test of controls to check their operating effectiveness. So other things being equal, this is the main point. This is the main point. Other things being equal, the greater the reliance the auditor places on the operating effectiveness of controls in the risk assessment, the greater the reliance the auditor places on the operative effectiveness of controls in the risk assessment, the greater is the extent of the auditor's test of control, or therefore sample size is increased. Because the auditor wants, I want to place my trust on the operating effectiveness of controls. He wants a higher level of trust. That higher level of trust can be achieved only by extensive checking, and therefore sample size is increased. Okay. Second factor, if there is an increase in the tolerable rate of deviation, the tolerable rate of deviation from the actual position, the deviation from the actual position, the auditor sets up a level that is the tolerable rate of deviation. If we increases that level, obviously sample size will decrease, because the auditor has increased his tolerance power. He's more stronger now. Oh, it's fine, completely fine. I'll increase my tolerable level of deviation from differences of 5,000 to 10,000. Differences of 10,000 amount in monetary value from the actual are common. It's quite usual. I'll correct it. I'll make them correct it. So it'll decrease the sample size because he's already increased his tolerance level. But if the auditor doesn't tolerate much, his tolerance levels are quite low, obviously he is conservative in his approach, he won't take any risk, and the sample size would be larger. Tolerable error, we have done it in the previous session. It is the maximum error in the population that the auditor is ready to accept in a given sample size. He knows that this would be there. So smaller the tolerable error, the larger would be the sample size, inversely proportional. So if the auditor's setting of tolerable error is lower, smaller, he is conservative, and his sample size, the number of strata in his sample would be more in huge quantity. He cannot work upon 100% of the population, but he'll try to cover as many strata in his sample from each stratum as possible. Third factor, in the case of test of controls, when there is an increase in the expected rate of deviation of the population to be tested, I have expectations from the client. I have expectations with respect to the rate of deviation from the actual facts and figures. And I find that there is going to be many such cases where I am going to find deviations. I come to a conclusion by test checking that there are going to be many cases where I can expect many deviations. So rate of again, conservative approach, sample size will increase. As higher the expected rate of deviation, larger the sample size needs to be, so that the auditor is in a position to make a reasonable estimate of the actual rate of deviation. The auditor will check more and more. The auditor will check more and more. And so that he can actually get to know what is the actual rate of deviation. This is expected rate, what he expects on the basis of its test check. And he wants to know approximately the actual rate of deviation. So how does the auditor expect the rate of deviation? On the basis of his understanding of the business, on the basis of his risk assessment procedures as per SA 330. When the auditor carries out his risk assessment procedures, what does he intend to do? What are the objectives of the risk assessment procedures? To understand the internal controls implemented by the client organization, whether they are weak, they are strong, designed properly, implemented properly, operating properly. So other factors could be changes in personnel or in internal controls, results of audit periods that could have been carried out by the same auditor or a different auditor, and the results of other audit procedures. So these are the procedures, these are the test procedures which an auditor carries out to expect the rate of deviation and further affect the sample size. Okay. The fourth factor, this was a third factor. The fourth factor, an increase in the auditor's desired level of assurance that the tolerable rate of deviation is not exceeded by the actual rate of deviation in the population. What does the auditor develops a confidence, the right level of confidence? The auditor should not be underconfident. He should neither be underconfident nor overconfident with respect to the level of assurance that the tolerable rate of deviation is not exceeded by the actual rate of deviation in the population. Tolerable rate of deviation is not exceeded by the actual rate of deviation in the population. So auditor has developed, set a tolerable rate, but if the actual rate might exceed this tolerable rate, the auditor will get conservative and will increase the sample size. The greater the level of assurance that the auditor desires, this is auditor's desire, that I want to place greater assurance that the actual rate of deviation will not exceed the tolerable rate of deviation. It will remain below that. I want to gain confidence with respect to this. If the auditor wants to gain confidence with respect to this, he would increase his sample size. He would direct more efforts, do more working, so that his trust, his confidence with respect to this particular statement is not broken. The last factor, in the case of large populations. In the case of large populations, the actual size of the population has little, if any, effect on sample size. For small populations, audit sampling may not be an efficient alternative means of obtaining audit evidence. For a small population, why do even we need to resort to sampling? For small populations, why do we even need to resort to sampling? We resort to sampling, we use audit sampling in the case of large populations, large data. So, in the case of large populations, doesn't affect, because we use sampling with large populations only. Our whole population is large only, only that is why we are using sampling technique. So this was with respect to test of controls, factors which influence the sample size for test of controls. Now the other part is test of details. What factors influence the sample size for test of details? So now we have moved from controls to the data, to the account balances, to the transactions. higher the auditor's assessment of the risk of material misstatement, the larger the sample size needs to be. Put yourself into the shoes of the auditor. He has been given an assignment to give his opinion about the true and fair view. As an auditor, I have carried out my tests and I feel that the risk of material misstatement is high. I have carried out my risk assessment procedures and I found that the risk of material misstatement is high. I'll go for good checking. Obviously, I will extract or draw a bigger sample. So the auditor, the auditor's assessment of the risk of material misstatement is affected by inherent risk and control risk. I suppose you have read about inherent risk and control risk. Inherent risk is the risk which cannot be avoided, and control risk is the risk arising as a result of weak controls. Okay. So, example is here. If the auditor does not perform test of controls, the auditor's risk assessment cannot be reduced for the effective operation of internal controls with respect to a particular assertion. Auditor hasn't performed test of controls. So there would be control risk, right? There would be control risk. To reduce audit risk to an acceptably low level, the auditor needs a low detection risk. We have already done this in chapter of risk assessment. Audit risk includes inherent risk, control risk, and detection risk. Inherent risk, you cannot do anything with it. Inherent risk is going to be there. It cannot be avoided. But definitely, we can decrease the control risk and detection risk. Control risk, if the controls are strong, control risk is lower. If the controls are weak, control risk is higher. What is control risk? A possibility of misstatement or material misstatement just because of weak controls. What is detection risk? That the auditor may not be able to find that particular misstatement or material misstatement. So if the control risk is higher, the auditor needs to keep his detection risk lower so that the overall audit risk is acceptably low. I'm not exaggerating this topic so much because this has already been covered in your chapter 4. Okay, so obviously the auditor has not performed test of controls. Control risk would be higher, and to keep the overall audit risk at a lower level, his detection risk should be low. To keep the detection risk low, he would have to check more transactions, more account balances, and again the sample size would be large. So thus, we can say that there will be an increase in sample size in the case of an increase in the auditor's assessment of the risk of material misstatement. In the case of test of details, the second part, please don't worry if you are not able to get anything. Once you will read it from the module, and you read it from the notes as well, twice you will be able to understand. It is not possible something which you are reading directly from the screen and I am making you understand. You'll be able to grasp it in the first instance. You might have to read it twice, thrice. Then again, keeping in mind the examples, you'll be able to understand the concept. So please don't worry. I can see 2 or 3 queries. Please don't worry. When you read it from the module and the notes, you'll be able to recollect what I am telling you now and you'll be sorted. Believe me. Don't panic. Okay? Just be with me. So the next factor is more the auditor is relying on other substantive procedures. So we test the details, we carry out substantive analytical procedures. Analytical procedures is your next chapter, chapter number 8. We carry out different kinds of alternative procedures as well to reduce our detection risk. So if we are directing our effort on other procedures as well, more other substantive procedures we are carrying out, we will minimize our effort on the samples, because we have other areas as well, we have other procedures as well which we are carrying out, and they'll also be yield us some results. So over here, if we don't work on a bigger sample, we can still expect results from those audit procedures if there is any deviation or misstatement, right? So in that case, the sample size can be smaller. What does it say? If there is an increase in the use of other substantive procedures directed at the same assertion, the size of sample will decrease. Take the case of account receivables, sundry debtors. You are carrying out many procedures. Just for the case of checking payments or the operating cycle, you can keep your sample from the debtors smaller. Instead of checking in detail out of the 20 debtors, major debtors, instead of checking in detail the 18 debtors, you can check 12 to 13, because you're checking the sales invoices as well, the credit sales ledger as well, you are obtaining external confirmations as well. You are carrying out other miscellaneous audit procedures with respect to debtors only as well. So you need not concentrate only on one particular procedure that involves sampling. You can decrease your sample size over here. Okay, fine. The third factor, an increase in the auditor's desired level of assurance. So be very much assured. Desired means the auditor wants it. So auditor's level of assurance, he wants the high level of assurance that tolerable misstatement is not exceeded by actual misstatement in that population. Again, the auditor has got conservative. He says, I want that actual misstatement should not exceed the level of the tolerable misstatement I have. I've given you 5 questions, and I tell you, if one question is wrong, it is completely fine. But if 2 questions are wrong, it's still okay. My tolerance level is 2. But if your 3 questions are wrong, I'll not tolerate that. What have you read? What have you learned? What have you revised? Your 3 questions out of 5 questions are wrong. So my tolerable level is 2. So if my tolerable misstatement level is 2, if the actual misstatement level in the population increases beyond 2, obviously I'm more conservative. I don't want it to increase, to pass beyond, to cross 2. So I want that level of assurance. While approaching exams, you want any paper, in any question in the exam, it should not be a case that we are not able to answer a question. We'll practice the RTPs, the MTPs, the assessment questions, the study material, the past questions, past examination questions. We want a high level of assurance that we are able to answer each and every question in the exam. So what do? You increase your resources. You study from every resource available to you. You practice every variety. You revise n number of times. just to obtain a higher level of assurance. You get conservative in your approach. I'll study day and night. I'll burn the midnight oil. But I cannot tolerate if I cannot answer more than one question in the examination hall. I'll not be able to tolerate. I'll panic. I'll get a panic attack. I'll get anxious. So what do? You increase your resources. In the same manner, the auditor will increase the sample size. His work more. He'll apply audit procedure or more strata. Hence, greater the level of assurance that the auditor requires that the results of the sample are in fact indicative of the actual amount of misstatement in the population. So whatever the results they derive from the sample, they're indicative of actual misstatement. Whatever misstatements you find in the sample, they are indicative of such kind of misstatements would be there in the population as well. Such percentage of misstatements would be there in the population as well. So if I have a lower tolerable level, I want a higher level of assurance, my sample size would be large, big. The next factor, an increase in tolerable misstatement. Again, I have set my tolerable level to 3. I tell you, okay, out of 5 questions, if 3 questions are wrong, it is okay. It is only the questions are tough. If you answer 2 questions, that is completely fine. Or while preparing for exams, I would say I need not question practice variety of questions. I have understood the concept. I need not practice each and everything. The cool dude attitude. I'm very cool, lenient in my approach. I have worked on the basis of the principle of smart study and not hard study. So my tolerable levels are higher. Even in the question paper, in the exam hall, if I'm not able to answer 50% of the questions, I am very much confident, my tolerable levels are high, that if I have understood the concept, I'll be able to answer those questions as well. I'll not be making stories. So what would I be doing? I would decrease my resources. I'll say I'll practice RTP, I'll practice StudyMet. It's fine. I'll practice from these 2 books only, and I'm going to sit in the exam like this. So in even that case, if the auditor's tolerable misstatement level increases, this will decrease his sample size. The next factor, the greater the amount of misstatement the auditor expects to find in the population. So I expect the question paper this time is going to be tough. It was easy the last time. Usually this is a notion in the students. This question paper was easy last time. Now it will be tough this time, right? I don't know from where do they get to know about this rumor. This is going to be tough. So I expect that this time this particular subject paper is going to be tough. What would I do? I would increase my resources. I would increase my study time. I would practice in detail in that particular subject. I'll devote more time to that subject. Because I expect that there would be tough questions. The questions would be tough in the upcoming exam. So the greater the amount of misstatement the auditor expects to find in the population, the larger will be the sample size. Larger sample size needs to be in order to make a reasonable estimate of the actual amount of misstatement in the population. The auditor expects that there could be major misstatements in the population. So factors relevant to the auditor's consideration that he expects misstatement. What are the factors? Which items are determined subjectively? The results of his risk assessment procedures. The results of tests of control. The results of audit procedures applied in periods. Same. The same point we have covered in test of controls as well. Okay. The next factor, when stratification of the population is appropriate. I find that when stratification of the population is appropriate. What does that mean? Sample size will decrease, but obviously I have divided my population appropriately. There is no error. So when stratification of the population is appropriate, I'm confident that whatever results I obtain from the sample, I can project in the on the population, and they'll give the results as per the sample. So the sample size will decrease. As when there is a variability in the monetary size of items in the population, it may be useful to stratify the population because we have variety in terms of monetary value. So if I'm able to divide my population appropriately, if I have divided my population appropriately, the homogeneous terms I have divided appropriately, I won't require a much bigger sample size. The next factor, the number of sampling units. So doesn't matter, negligible effect, because for large populations, the actual size of the population has little effect on sample size. Again, the same point which we have covered in test of controls. The same point which we have done in test of controls, the number of sampling units or the large population. So this is what factors that influence the sample size for test of controls and test of details. See, we have to extract a sample from the population, right? We have designed the criteria on the basis of which we'll be extracting the sample. Now, further in the next step, we need to understand what should be our sample size. It should not be the case that we are working too much on the same kind of items. If you are reading the same chapter again and again and again, you will be leaving much of your syllabus behind while preparing for the exam. Because you are practicing same kind of questions time and again. Oh, I'm doing good, I'm doing good. You have done 2 questions. You made mistakes. The same kind of 4 questions you have done. I'm doing good. Now you're doing the same questions again and again. Oh, I'm good. I'm going to crack the exam. No. If you are doing repetitions on the same kind of items, you're wasting your time. So the auditor needs to be completely aware and accurate about the sample size he has to extract from the population, from the stratum, so that his work time are not compromised. So that is why these factors are there. These factors are basically the situations. They have given the situation that in this situation, the sample size needs to be larger. In this situation, the sample size needs to be lower. So in those cases where the auditor develops a conservative approach, the sample size would be larger. In those cases where the auditor has a lenient approach, the sample size would be lower. So this is the case with sample size. Okay. This was, I can understand, this was a harder part, and you need to read it twice, thrice to understand the factors and their effect. So the next part is sample selection methods. Before we proceed for the next part, let's take a break of 10 minutes. We'll be back at 7:40. We'll be back at 7:40 and we'll do the sample selection methods. So we have covered how to design the sample, then size of the sample, now how to select the sample. So this is the last step in working to extract sample. After this part, we'll apply our audit procedures on the sample. So we have a break for 10 minutes and we'll be back at 7:40. Okay, students, we are back. Last part in sampling process, the sample selection methods. Oh, sorry, not the last part in sampling process, but in last part in the process of extracting samples. So, the sample selection methods. And if I'm not wrong, almost all of you would have got the opportunity to play that game Housey, Tambola. Have you? Reply me, please. I need to know that you all are back with me over here. So, have you ever played Housey or Tambola ever? If you have played that game, whether online during the COVID period, it was quite popular at that time, or in your get togethers, parties, functions, you'll understand the sample selection methods really well. Numbers 1 to 90 are the population for you. And whatever you choose from that, that particular number is a sample. Yes. Tambola, Housey, one and the same thing. One and the same thing. Okay, okay, okay. Fine. So let us get to understand what are the sample selection methods. The first method, so we have many sample selection methods: random sampling, systematic sampling, monetary unit sampling, haphazard sampling, block sampling. So with the literal meanings of these words, I can very well understand what would these methods encompass. Random sampling out of nowhere, no mathematical, no specific technique or something, randomly any kind of strata. Systematic would definitely include a systematic approach. Monetary unit based upon monetary value. Haphazard, anything. You might have done those questions, probability questions, two balls of three colors in a bag, 12 balls, red balls, white balls, black balls, and all that stuff, right? So I pick up, take out any one ball from that bag randomly. I take out any two balls, right? What do we used to do? When we don't get any prizes, when we didn't used to get any prizes in Tambola, we'll ask the person speaking out the numbers, please shake the bowl. We are not getting our numbers. So that is this is how the sample selection methods are. So the first one is random sampling without following any specific system or sequence. So random selection ensures that all items in the population or within each stratum have a known chance of selection. Randomly, you are picking any ball from the bag. All types of balls have the chance of being grabbed by your hand. So we could also use random number tables. Random number tables are a mathematical technique. If you have done the subject of operations research or in statistics, you might know about random number tables. I won't comment upon it over here because it is just a statistical technique. You can read about it. So random sampling has two methods. Simple random sampling, as the name suggests. So every unit, every strata has the chance of getting selected. In a class of 40 students, I would say I'll pick any student. If I develop an approach, I'll pick two students from first row, two students from the second row, and two students from the third row. That is a systematic manner. But I'll say I'll pick any 6 students from the whole batch. Those 6 students might be sitting together. Those 6 students might be all girls, might be all boys. I'll pick them randomly. So every student has a chance of getting selected. So each unit of the whole population has a chance of getting selected. It could be, I said, let me check your invoices. How do you maintain your invoices? Bring me the invoices file for the last 2 days. So they'll bring 2 or 3 kinds of files. I might check the purchase invoices. I might check the expenses. I might check the sales invoices. So each item in the population is selected by the use of random number tables, either with the help of a computer or picking up a number in a random way from a bowl, like roulette wheel games, lottery games, or when you pick slips from a bowl. 40 students, they have written their name on the chits, all chits jumbled up in the bowl, and you pick one slip. We used to play these games at birthday parties and at school. Today, random numbers are generated using various applications on cell phones like the random number generator. Who would have thought Tambola or Housey could be played on phones as well, cell phones as well? The lockdown period, the period during the COVID, make that happen as well. So this method is considered appropriate provided the population to be sampled consists of almost a similar units and fall within a reasonable range. Homogeneous population. If I say we have a game of Housey or Tambola where numbers are marked from 1 to 1,000, quite a large population, it would be really difficult to get a prize and the game would run for days. But the population falls within a range when it is from 1 to 90 and all the numbers have an equal chance of getting selected. We use our idea or random number tables, any criteria to choose randomly from the population. Right? So this is the way to select samples from the population. How do you select samples from the population? The second category is stratified sampling. So we divide the population into stratums and we extract samples from each stratum. Large population. I said, okay, students, 40 students. I'll pick any 6 students. That is simple random sampling. What is stratified sampling? Divide the students into science students, commerce students, and I'll select 10 students from each group. So first of all, I have divided the population into stratum and I'll select the samples from each stratum. That is stratified sampling. See in the example over here on the right side, you can see an image. There is this whole population. I've divided into group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4. And I can extract samples from each group or I can take items from each group and form a sample of the population. So the method involves dividing the whole population to be tested in a few separate groups called strata and taking a sample from each of them called stratum. Sorry. Each stratum is treated as if it was a separate population. Stratified is also random. No. It could be random, it could be systematic. It depends the criteria you choose. Usually here stratified is random only because you have made stratum and out of that stratum you are choosing your sample randomly. It is just an approach. It is a method. The number of groups into which whole population has to be divided is determined on the basis of auditor's judgment. Because the population is highly diverse, weight should be allocated, importance should be allocated, ranks should be allocated. So we can see it is just an extension of simple random sampling. In simple random sampling, we don't form groups, directly choose the sample. But in stratified sampling, we first, a different layer, another layer has been added. We first categorize into groups and then choose samples from each group to form a sample from the whole population. Yes, Charu, right. So we have an example. We are dividing the trade receivable balances into four groups. Excess of 10 lakh, 7 lakh 75,000 to 10 lakh, 5 lakh 50,000 1 to 775, 225 to 550, and balances below 225. So these are all, the population of trade receivables has been divided into these stratum. From these above groups, the auditor may pick up different percentage of items from each of the group. So from the top group, that is balance in excess of rupees 10 lakh, the auditor may examine all the items. He says, I won't extract any sample, draw any sample. I will examine all such debtors who are having a balance excess of 10 lakh, whose balance is outstanding in excess of rupees 10 lakhs. From the second group, 775 to 10, I might choose 25%. From the third group, 10%. From the lowest group, 2%. And for those balances which are below the 2,25,000 limit, I won't derive any sample. I won't check them. Quite low in amount, outside the purview of my checking. So this is a perfect example of how stratified sampling an auditor would do. And these kind of sampling, these kind of filters, checks are available in Microsoft Excel and as well as your accounting softwares, auditing softwares. So this is way an auditor resorts to stratified sampling. Or just don't confuse yourself. Don't confuse yourself. Let us understand what is systematic sampling first, and then I'll answer your question. So what is interval sampling or systematic sampling? We are done with random sampling. Now systematic sampling. We will follow some rule. Systematic selection is a selection method in which the number of sampling units in the population is divided by the sample size to give a sampling interval. You know, the class interval questions we used to do in questions of mean, median, mode, standard deviation. You remember? Mean deviation and all. So we divide the number of sampling units in the population by the sample size we want to give a sampling interval. For example, we have a sampling interval of 50 and we start with 50. So what would we do? We'll check entries at every 50th level. So each 50th sampling unit thereafter is selected in an entry of 5 lakh units. What you will do, you will select 50th item, 100 item, 150, 200, 250, 300. The interval is, systematic interval is 50. You have formed a base, some idea in your mind. Okay, not randomly. Randomly, I would have chosen, okay, 40 number, 80 number, 95, 96, 1000, 200. That is random. Systematic is, I have formed a base. Every 50th number. So I'll be choosing 50, 100, 150, 200. That is systematic and that includes an interval. The starting point may be determined as randomly, haphazardly. But the whole sample would be determined by the use of a computerized random number generator or random number tables. So there would be use of random number tables over here as well, but we have given it a criteria. Out of 40 students, I would say, okay, roll number 3, roll number 5, roll number 9, roll number 12, roll number 15, roll number 20, I'm choosing. But in the case of systematic sampling, I would say all students having odd roll number are selected for today. All students having even roll numbers will be selected for Viva tomorrow. So this is the difference between random and systematic sampling. So we need to take care of one point here. When using systematic selection, the auditor would need to determine that sampling units within the population are not structured in such a way that the sampling interval corresponds with a particular pattern in the population. So you have, we'll see with an example. I'll see if this example corresponds to this. Fine. Otherwise, I'll make you understand the last point. In a population of branch cells, particular branches occur only as every 100 item, and the sampling interval selected is 100. So the population is branch cells. The ledger head is branch cells. I might be having 10 branches. So my head is branch sales. Branch sales will include sales of all the 10 branches. So particular branch, my branch A sales from branch A occur at every 100th item. At every 100th invoice relates to branch A. There is a pattern. I have attached serial numbers. And at every 100th, after every 99 invoices, the 100th invoice relates to branch A. And as per my systematic sampling, I'll pick every 100th invoice for my auditing. I'll pick 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, and that. What am I doing? I'm getting in my sample only branch A invoices. No invoices from any other branch. There is a strict pattern in the invoices maintained by the company with respect to branch sales. So it says the same. When using systematic selection, auditor needs to determine that sampling units within the population are not structured in a way that the sampling interval corresponds to a particular pattern, which is happening in our example. The result would be that either the auditor would have selected all or none of the sales of that particular branch. If I have set my interval at 100, my sample would consist of only branch A sales. All other branches would be neglected. And if my sample consists of every 101, every 100 plus first invoice, every invoice after 100th invoice, my branch A sales would not find a place in the sample. So we have to take care that if there is a particular pattern in the population, interval sampling might not yield good samples. So if accountant A is responsible to record all transactions in a particular month, and accountant B, another example, next month, if this structure is same throughout the year and the auditor determines a sample to check every transaction of alternate months, then only one accountant's work is being checked by the auditor. He says, I'll be checking alternatively from January every sales invoices, the sales ledger. So he is going to check only accountant A's work. Accountant B might have been making mistakes, but that is out of my sample now. So I have to make sure that while going for systematic sampling, there should not be a particular pattern on the population. Okay. So this is what intermittent sampling is, and I hope Ojasvi It is cleared now. Random and systematic. Yeah. Okay, now I get it. Yeah, I told you. Fine. Next, monetary unit sampling, value weighted. Someone asked me value weighted. So I told give you the example of ABC analysis on the basis of monetary values. See, if I divide my debtor balances below 5 lakh, above 5 lakh, and I say I'll check only above 5 lakh balances and not below 5 lakh, that is monetary unit sampling. Okay. So if I say like I won't check any of the expenses from the profit and loss which are falling below the level of 1,000 rupees. So I'll derive my samples only of my sample would consist of expenses relating to a particular head, selling expenses or delivery expenses, only those, or freight expenses or courier expenses, only where the invoice value is more than 1,000. That is monetary unit sampling. Haphazard sampling. Haphazard sampling as it is. The auditor will not use any random number table or 1, 2, 3, or even nothing. They'll say, okay, any 5 students, any 4 students, come on, those who reach first, those who all I can see in one go. The haphazard selection, in which the auditor selects the sample without following a structured technique. So if you are using statistical sampling, haphazard sampling is not appropriate because it has no base. It does not involve judgment. It does not use random number tables. What we say in Hindi with blind eyes, आंखें बंद करके आंखें मूंद के कुछ भी select कर लें. That is haphazard selection. The next, block sampling. What is block sampling? This method involves selection of a block of continuous items from within the population. Block selection cannot ordinarily be used in audit sampling because most populations are structured that the items in a sequence can be expected to have similar characteristics to each other, but different characteristics from items elsewhere in the population. What is block sampling? We make blocks, we divide them into blocks. It is not usually suggested. So I'd say in a factory, I'm going to check every alternate block of products being dispatched by them to check for the quality of stock. Because when in a block, usually all the items would have similar characteristics. There would not be, they would be homogeneous block sampling, but we have to draw samples which have homogeneous characters. There could be an issue where the continuous transactions at the level of test of details have similar characteristics. So we are selecting the same block every time. We have to develop stratums, divide population into stratums which have different characteristics. Each stratum will have different characteristics, and from each stratum we will select a sample and apply our audit procedures. But if we are dividing the population into stratums or blocks, and all the blocks are having same, or stratum having same characteristics, what is the need of sampling? Why did you stratify it? Let us take the help of an example. Take the first 200 sales invoices from the sales day book in the month of September. Alternatively, take any 4 blocks of 50 sales invoices. Therefore, once the first item in the block is selected, the rest of the block follows items to the completion. For 200 sales invoices from the sales day book in the month of September, we are taking 200 sales invoices, or we are taking 4 blocks of 50 sales, one and the same thing. What is the difference? So usually block sampling doesn't find much importance over. It is kind of it is almost similar to non-statistical sampling. Doesn't follow any statistics. Simple, economical, but there could be a risk of bias and a pattern of selection. The same problem we found in interval sampling. There could be a pattern repeated after every interval, and therefore block sampling is usually not suggested. So basically, what did we do? We covered the various methods of selecting samples from the population. What did we cover? Random sampling, where we did simple random sampling and stratified random sampling. Then systematic or interval sampling, monetary unit sampling, haphazard sampling, and block sampling. So in the sampling process, we first covered the auditor's procedures, auditor's factors. Second, sample design, sample size, sample selection methods. Now we are done with the sample selection. We have reached halfway through. We have reached halfway through. Now we are done with the sample. The sample is on our table. Now we have to apply our audit procedures on it. So the auditor shall perform audit procedures appropriate to the purpose of his audit on each item selected. If a particular audit procedure is not applicable to the selected item, the procedure should be done on a replacement item. Yes, Ojasvi, you are right. So if you are not able, item is what? Your strata in the sample. So the strata in the sample, now you have developed a sample from the stratum. Now you'll work upon each and every item of the sample. If you are not able to apply a particular procedure on the selected item, look for another item, another element in that particular sample. If he is not able to apply any of the procedures to a selected item, the auditor shall treat it out of prescribed control. So when can an auditor apply the procedure on a replacement item? Example is a voided check, cancelled check is selected while testing for evidence of payment authorization. You would be having a cancelled check with you. In many of the organizations, they ask for a cancelled check. Give us a cancelled check in proof so that we can transfer your payment. The payment is getting into the right account, being made to the right account. If the auditor is satisfied that the check has been properly cancelled such that it does not constitute a deviation, an appropriately chosen replacement is examined. So a replacement would then mean a proper and valid check through which payment has been made. So here is an example of a replacement item. So auditor wants to apply procedures on the checks. If he feels that a cancelled check, he has applied his procedure on a cancelled check. He selected a cancelled check while testing for evidence of payment authorization. If he is satisfied that a check has been properly cancelled, it does not constitute a deviation, he'll check for another replacement item further. So he'll go for a valid check. So the payment is being made through a valid check or not. Whether a check is cancelled or it has been properly made, the payment is not being made to the other person. What is the reason? So this is how an auditor makes sure that he applies his procedures on a replacement item as well, because his particular procedure is not applicable to the selected item. What procedures would be applicable for a valid check are not applicable on the cancelled check. If he comes across a cancelled check, procedures would be applied relating to cancelled check, and he'll apply other procedures on a valid check. So we have an example when the auditor is unable to apply designed audit procedures to a selected item. The example is when documentation relating to that item has been lost. Sir, there was a fire in our storeroom, document room. We could save as many documents possible, but we lost the invoices evidencing the purchase of this particular machine or of a particular sales file relating to a particular debtor or particular day. So let's take the letter example. If the documentation of a sales is lost, like the sales order record, the sales invoice, document for dispatch, etc., what can we do? What would be a replacement item? External confirmation. We can seek confirmation from the debtor as per SA 505. Yes, did this client make sales to you on this particular day? If it is a cash sale, then cash book can be cross-verified for the existence of such transactions. Okay, you have lost sale invoices, it is completely fine. Show us the cash book if it was a cash sale. Let us check it. There are some bars under the income tax law on cash transactions. Let us check it. If you don't have the invoice, what amount of sales you made in cash? Or if it was made on credit, we insist on getting a confirmation from the debtor, to whom you sold, all the debtors to whom you sold material on that particular day. So auditor was unable to apply a design audit procedures to sales invoices relating to that particular day, week. So there are some alternative procedures. Another example of a suitable alternative procedure might be the examination of subsequent cash receipts together with evidence of their source and the items they are intended to settle when no reply has been received in response to a positive confirmation request. We ask the debtor whether sales were made by this client company to you on these 2 days and of what amount. We haven't received any confirmation, and they have lost the invoices. Now in their records, they have told, in their records, they have punched in the data. They have the data which says that they made sales of 5 lakh rupees to this particular debtor. So the debtor is not giving me a response to the positive. What is a positive confirmation request? We ask a question whose answer is in yes or no. I would write them a letter or a mail that our client says, as per their data, that they made sales to you of amount with 5 lakhs on these 2 days, these 2 dates. Please reply in affirmation or negative whether this fact is correct or not. We haven't received any reply. So what would be the alternative procedure? We'll check what receipts are we getting from the debtor after that date. And we'll check whether those receipts evidence that yes, sales had been made. That is why they are giving money to our client company. Now, if we need to replace a sample, what could be the example? If all transactions of computerized sales are being checked, for example, sales recorded through a barcode scanner, and incidentally a sample of manual billing gets selected, then such item can be replaced after adequately checking the correctness of the manual bill with the supporting documents available. So we are checking all the entries in the data with the sales recorded through a barcode scanner. You see, in those franchisee businesses and the departmental stores, they just scan the barcode on every product, and the bill gets automatically prepared through the scan machine, barcode scanning machine, from the computer, their software. While checking those sales, we come across a manual bill. How do we check it? We check the manual bill with all the supporting documents. We'll ask for all the supporting documents. And if they cannot provide us with all the supporting documents, we will resort to additional or alternative audit procedures. So this is the kind of audit procedures we have to perform with the samples. Now, what happens if we find some deviations and misstatement? In analyzing the deviations and misstatements identified, the auditor may observe that many have a common feature. All the deviations have a common feature. For example, every check below the level of 10,000, every expense below the level of 500. The expense has been recorded, but in the relevant head and not in the cash book. So if the auditor develops that, finds that deviations and misstatements identified have a common feature, like the deviation and misstatements relate to only branch A sales or branch B sales, they have a common feature. In such circumstances, the auditor may decide to identify all items in the population that possess their common feature and extend audit procedures to those items. So I found a common feature that branch A sales are inflated. Only branch A sales, as per the sample obtained of various branches. My sample contains sales from branch A, branch B, branch C, branch D. But I find a common feature with the branch A sales that they are quite inflated. So in such circumstances, I as an auditor may decide, check every sales invoice and every sales entry, sales ledger of branch A. Because I can smell something fishy, and these misstatements could be intentional and they may indicate the possibility of fraud. So the auditor has to investigate the nature and cause of any deviations or misstatements identified in the sample and evaluate how would they affect their audit, and if they can affect on other areas of the audit as well, and he needs to go beyond the sample and check extensively the whole population with respect to that particular common feature. And there could be such extremely rare circumstances when the auditor considers a misstatement or deviation to be an anomaly. Anomaly is something wrong, we'll discuss. The auditor shall obtain a high degree of certainty that such misstatement or deviation is not representative of the population that we found an error of high intensity, anomaly, different from what it should have been, I need to be highly assured that if it is there in the sample, it is not there in the whole population. Like in the case of blood test, the doctor advises her to get the blood tested again after 2 days. He wants to be assured that whatever has been found in the first report, if it is repeated in the next report, that means there is this particular infection or deficiency in the blood in the whole body. So auditor is concerned that if I have found an anomaly in a sample, it should not be there in the whole population. So auditor would perform additional audit procedures to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence that the misstatement or deviation does not affect the remainder of the population. The auditor will get conservative. He'll follow a conservative approach then. What is anomaly? Here we have. Anomaly may be defined as a misstatement or deviation that is demonstrably not representative of misstatements or deviations in a population. Something, a misstatement or deviation that is seen in a sample but not found in the population. How could it be? I need to check more. Because I have found an anomaly. That misstatement or deviation found in a sample but is not representing in the population. That is an anomaly. So the auditor will evaluate the nature and cause of such deviations and misstatements found in the samples. Now, after analyzing everything, I need to project the misstatements found in the sample to the whole population. Now, I need to apply the results of sample of audit procedures applied on the sample to the whole population. I'm going to the doctor with my blood reports. Doctor, here is the blood sample report. The doctor will study the report and now he'll say, yes, you have iron deficiency. Blood sugar level is quite high. You have this infection. So what does the doctor do? He studies that report and projects it, corresponds it with the symptoms I tell my doctor. I'm having severe headache, nausea, weakness. So doctor will corroborate whatever I am telling him and whatever is there in the report. In the same way, an auditor would project the misstatements or deviations found in the sample to the whole population. So he is required to project, apply the results of sample on the whole population. If a misstatement has been established as an anomaly, it may be excluded while doing such projection, because anomaly would give different results. We have to treat it separately. We have to consider it separately now. And the effect of anomaly, if uncorrected, we have to get it corrected. If it is uncorrected, we have to add it to our final result of projecting misstatements on the population. The last part, in the case of test of details, the auditor shall project misstatements found in the sample to the population, wherein in the case of test of controls, projection explicitly is not required, since the sample deviation rate is all the projected deviation rate for the population as a whole. Whatever you have tested in controls, in the samples, it will be representative of the whole population. But in the case of test of details, we have to project those misstatements on the population. In the case of controls, if I'm checked cameras, security options, another thing, if there are any deviations, that means there are deviations in the controls. The sample was just helping me to gain an understanding of the weakness in the controls. But in the case of test of details, at the assertion level, the account balances and transactions, because they are quite large in volume, I'll definitely need to project the results of the sampling on the whole population. That's a bit of the difference for sampling in test of controls and test of details. Now, the last part of the chapter, the last part of the sampling process, evaluating the results. The auditor shall evaluate the results of the sample, and he shall evaluate whether the use of audit sampling has provided a reasonable basis for conclusions about the whole population. The doctor will check the sample report and he'll come to a conclusion whether this blood test report is providing me a reasonable basis for expressing my opinion on the health condition of the patient, or do I need to get the test conducted again. In the same way, the auditor will evaluate the results of the sample and whether the use of audit sampling has provided a reasonable basis, whether it is enough so that I can project misstatements on the population. Projecting misstatements on the population is like, Pooja, I found that from the invoices file, I derived some sample, extracted some samples from the invoices files, and I found from the purchase invoices that many of the invoices are missing. So in that case, my population was documentation of invoices. So from the sample of some purchase invoices and sales invoices, I found that the calculation of taxes, GST, on the invoices was at improper rate. So I'll come to a conclusion that I will have to check the effect of GST in the whole population, because from the samples I have drawn, I found this deviation in calculation of GST in the invoices. This will affect the purchase amount, sale amount, and the GST balances, the GST ledger maintained with the organization. So I have projected what? I have applied. Projecting misstatements means whatever deviation or misstatement I have found in the sample, I'm applying, I'm assuming the same to be present in the whole population. That is called projecting misstatement to the whole population from the sample results. So for test of controls, an unexpectedly high sample deviation rate may lead to an increase in the assessed risk of material misstatement. High deviation means high risk. The auditor has assessed the risk to be high, and the further audit evidence substantiating the initial assessment is obtained. So auditor needs to determine whether he needs to obtain further added evidence to support this fact, that is, there is a sample deviation rate is quite high from what it should have been actual while testing controls. So the auditor may come to a conclusion that there is high risk of material mistake. In case of test of details, an unexpected, which was not expected, an unexpected high misstatement amount in a sample may cause the auditor to believe that a class of transactions or account balances, like in my example, the class of transactions was those transactions where GST is involved, and account balance would be the GST ledger as well as all the ledgers which are interrelated with GST, is materially misstated. So for the test of controls, I'm evaluating my results. For test of details, I'm evaluating my results and checking whether the sample deviation rate is high, sample misstated amount is high. I'll project it on the population. In the case of test of details, the projected misstatement plus the misstatement kept aside for time being having anomalous misstatement, which was there in the sample but not found in the population, if any, is the auditor's best estimate of misstatement in the population. Projected misstatements from the sample results to the whole population plus anomalous misstatements would be my best evidence. They'll help me to estimate misstatements in the whole population. And the summation of projected, the number, the incidents of projected misstatement plus anomalous misstatement. Projection means you are applying the results of sampling on the whole population. So if such misstatements exceed my tolerable level of misstatement, the sample does not provide a reasonable basis for conclusion. And I might have to go for extensive checking. The closer the projected misstatement plus anomalous misstatement is to tolerable misstatement, the more likely that actual misstatement in the population may exceed tolerable misstatement. This is a fact based upon experience. The sample does not provide a reasonable basis. More the effect of projected plus anomalous statement is near to the tolerable level, more likely that actual misstatements may exceed the tolerable level. So this is how the auditor evaluates the results. If projected misstatement is greater than the auditor's expectation of misstatement, the auditor will conclude that there is an unacceptable sampling risk because actual misstatement is exceeding the tolerable misstatement. He'll resort to more extensive checking. Now, there could be a case, as we have seen in previous circumstances, that the auditor might have resort to other audit procedures. How do these audit procedures help the auditor? They help in assessing the risk that actual misstatement in the population might exceed the tolerable misstatement level. The risk may be reduced if additional audit evidence is obtained. He'll do alternate procedures, additional procedures. If he comes to a conclusion that audit sampling has confused me, it has not provided me a reasonable basis for conclusions about the population. The conclusions are quite varied. The auditor may ask the management, he may request the management to investigate misstatements that have been identified. And there could be further misstatements as well. And to make necessary adjustments or tailor the nature, time, and extent of his further audit procedures to achieve the required level of assurance, on the basis of which he may give his opinion in the audit report. He may find that sampling was ineffective. So he'll do other audit procedures and will ask the management, whatever misstatements have been found by sampling technique, please identify them and look for other misstatements. And I'll the nature, timing, I'll improve, I'll make adjustments to the nature, time, and extent of my audit procedure. Okay. So this is how the auditor will evaluate the results. That was all about the sampling process. And with the end of the sampling process, we are done with your chapter of audit sampling as well. Any doubts till now, you can come up with it. And we have a case study based upon this chapter. We'll practice this, the case study. And there are some technical parts in this chapter. So I'll suggest you people to please read whatever we have covered today twice or thrice at least. And when you practice the questions from the study material, from the case study, which I'll be sharing with you, which we'll be doing over here, you'll be able to understand and grasp the concepts better. Okay. So if there are any doubts or queries still there, please come up with it. Otherwise, I'll switch to the case scenario. I hope you can all see the case study I've shared. Is it visible to everyone? Yes, Ojasvi, at the end of the session, I'll take your question. But I'll have to look for this question. So please, can you please copy paste it again? Or only when I'll tell you. I'll tell you when to copy paste it again or write it again, okay? After we are done with the case study. Fine. I'll take your question. So please answer me. Can you see the case study on your screens? I've shared the relevant file with you. Is it visible? Please reply so that I can resume with the case study. Jaji, is it visible? Okay. This is a case study with respect to chapter 7. Okay, be with me. We'll read the case study and then answer the questions. Okay. CA Rashik Sharma is employed as an internal auditor with Fulchand Pharmaceuticals Limited and looks after day-to-day accounting queries and audit requirements of the company. With the company having such a huge turnover, customer base, and network, Mr. Sharma finds it difficult to audit each and every transaction and aspect of accounting and controls. He understands that to ensure good and reasonable standard of work, he should adopt some standards and techniques that can lead him to an informed professional opinion. So he wants to resort to sampling techniques to solve this issue. He is aware that his methods and procedures will be governed by SA 530, which is a standard of auditing on audit sampling, whereby his objective would be to provide a reasonable basis to draw conclusions about the population from which the sample is selected. Appropriateness, completeness, and reliability of the population in question are some of the characteristics it needs to possess. Mr. Sharma is more inclined towards statistical sampling in his approach. However, where exact accuracy is required, or in the case of any legal requirement, he switches to non-statistical approach in which his experience and judgment are the caretakers of the game. He makes it a point that in considering the characteristics of a population for test of controls, he has to make assessment of the expected rate of deviation based on his understanding of the relevant controls in order to design an audit sample and to determine the sample size. He also considered SA 530, which provided him the guidance on the use of stratification and value-weighted sampling techniques based on a unique parameter. Thus, he found it comparatively easier to render professional services effectively using sampling techniques. This is a case study with the story of C. Rachik Sharma as internal auditor at that company and using sampling. Now let us come to the question. First question. Mr. Sharma wants to test for overstatement of accounts receivable. Overstatement of accounts receivable, he wants to test for it. So he wants to derive sample to apply SA 530 audit sampling. So the population from where he can draw this sample for this purpose could be defined as accounts receivable listing. So he's telling you that he wants to test for overstatement of accounts receivable, and the population for this purpose could be defined as the accounts receivable listing. The population is also given and characteristic is also given. Which characteristic of populations deems significance over here? To check for overstatement of accounts receivable, the population is accounts receivable listing. Which characteristic of population deems significance over here? Reliable, completeness, appropriateness, all of the above. Answers, please. Answers to the first question. D. All. C, C, C. D. Okay. As far as I feel, I might be wrong. I'm guessing it with you. Not guessing, but let us see. My answer is C. It is C. The auditor will need to determine that the population from which the sample is drawn is appropriate for the specific audit objective. What is my specific audit objective over here? To test for overstatement of accounts receivable. And if you remember, I took the same example, and the same example is given in your module chapter as well, in the part where they explain the appropriateness, of population. So the answer is C. We took the same example when we discussed appropriateness as a feature of the population. Coming to next question. Mr. Sharma selects sales of March, June, and September as samples in the previous year as different from what he selected during the last year audit. So what is Mr. Sharma doing? Mr. Sharma selects sales of March, June, and September as samples in the previous year as different from what he selected during the last year's audit. In the last year, he might have chosen January, February, July, April sales. This year, he is choosing sale of March, June, and September. So what kind of technique is he using? Statistical sampling. This is not satisfied sampling, it is statistical sampling. I'll correct it before uploading it for you. Not satisfied sampling, it is statistical sampling. Non-statistical sampling, periodic sampling, stratified sampling. Answers, please. Statistical sampling, non-statistical sampling, periodic sampling, and stratified sampling. Good, Harsh. Good. Good, Ojasvi. The answer is non-statistical sampling. He hasn't divided the population of sales. There is no particular criteria for the division of population. How could it be stratified or periodic sampling? It is non-statistical sampling. He is just choosing them on the basis of his professional judgment. So under statistical sampling, non-statistical sampling, the sample size and its composition are determined on the basis of the personal experience and knowledge of the auditor. So it is non-statistical sampling. Third question. Which of the following factors can be the deciding criterion to use the desired sampling method in the above case scenario? I suppose the answer has found its relevance in this only. So, which is the criterion in the above case? Above case means the above question. Second question is related to second question. Which of the following factors can be the deciding criterion to use the desired sampling method in the above case scenario? We have already read it in the answer, the auditor's judgment. Answer would be A. The decision whether to use statistical or non-statistical sampling approach is a matter of auditor's judgment. However, sample size is not a valid criterion to distinguish between statistical and non-statistical approaches. You'll find all these questions and their answers in the notes I'm going to upload, as well as in your chapter in the study material, from the study material. All the examples, all the questions, all the answers have been taken from there only. Fourth question. In considering the characteristics of the population for tests of controls, Mr. Sharma finds that the accepted rate of deviation is unacceptably high. The accepted rate of deviation is unacceptably high. Hence, he would decide to perform test of controls, not perform test of controls, perform extensive test of controls, withdraw from such audit engagement. Answer to fourth question, please. This example we discussed today itself. In the factors that would decide the sample size for test of controls. Answer to fourth question. When he has already found that the accepted rate of deviation is high, unacceptably, he cannot accept, but the rate of deviation is high at the organization level. The rate of deviation is already high within the organization. Why would he need to test the controls then? Because there is deviation, and the accepted rate of deviation is high, unacceptably high. He would decide not to perform the test of controls. This was an example which he took today. Good, Harsh. Samyak, really good. Good. Samyak, good, Harsh. We discussed this example today only, in today's lecture only. Stratification of population under audit improves audit efficiency. When Mr. Sharma performs tests of details in the above case, he would stratify the population by. So it says stratification of population under audit improves audit efficiency. Mr. Sharma wants to perform test of details in the above case. He would stratify the population by. So we did it today, that in the case of test of details, stratification may be done on a particular basis, and that particular basis is size, monetary value, any random basis, or age of accounts in question. Size, monetary value, random basis, or age of accounts in question. We have covered it today only. When we were studying stratification and value weighted selection, in the case of test of details, this particular statement was right over there. I'm looking for a right answer. The answer is B, monetary value. This allows greater audit effort to be directed to the larger value items, as these items may contain the greatest potential misstatement in terms of overstatement. When we were covering test of detail factors in stratification, it was written over there that in case of test of details, we usually stratify the value by population by monetary value. Nice, Ria. Rightly answered. Surbhi, Charu, good. What happened to you, Ojasvi? Sixth question. Which of the following is not a source of risk that would materialize if CA Sharma deviates from his preferred sampling method and proceeds with another method as required by law as told in the above case? Human mistakes, misinterpreting the sample results, applying audit procedures not appropriate to the objective of the audit. Which of the following is not a source of risk that would materialize if CA Sharma deviates from his good Sushil, good preferred sampling method and proceeds with another method as required by law as told in the above case? A, human mistakes. B, misinterpreting the same results, sample results. C, applying audit procedures not appropriate to the objective of the audit. Or D, none. I've read human mistakes, misinterpreting, they all fall under the same category, A, B, C. So only D option is left with me. I would suggest the answer is D. I would think. Let us see. Oh, yes. All other options are definite risks if non-statistical sampling is followed. And in this question, he's telling us that he's following non-statistical sampling method because it has been told by law. And we have read non-statistical sampling method is followed if it is regulatory or law requires it. So in that case, these all are definite sources of risk in that case. So the question is asking not a source of risk, but these are the sources of risk while we follow non-statistical sampling. So the answer is none. Good, Ojasvi, good. Good, Sushil. Really nice. Nahi, Harsh. No. Last question. Which of the following factors is C. Rachik Sharma considering in determining the sample size for the tests of control? Projected error, tolerable error, expected error, both B and C. B is tolerable error and expected error. I haven't read projected error. Did we discuss projected error? So what were the other factors? Tolerable error, I did discuss. Expected error, I did discuss. So while determining the sample size for test of control, I did discuss expected error as well as tolerable error. So my answer is both B and C, tolerable error and expected error. The answer to seventh question. Oh, nice. Oh, everybody is right with this question. Good, 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 good. Riya, Kushi, Ojasvi, Charu, Vrinda, Sushil, Surbi. Really nice, man. Really nice. Everybody's answered the question rightly. Good. So I'll make the necessary corrections and upload the notes as well as the case study along with answers of this chapter for you before the end of the day by midnight today itself. And we'll conclude the session. But before that, let me answer Ojasvi's question. So Ojasvi asked me what strategy should we follow for our CA exams, like we should do revision and learning along with classes, or should we finish our classes and then do revision and learning part? Because only the classes go on for about 8 to 10 hours, then there is only the time to only read the daily contents. So Ojasvi, just attend the classes, read the study material along with, make notes if you want, and if you are happy and if you are feel satisfied and contented with the notes you get and the study material, practice all the questions, understand the concept accurately, right? Writing noting on your book or notebook, whatever you are writing with, just prepare the material for learning. It is quite normal that you'll be forgetting all this at the end, while at the time of when your exams would be near. There will be huge time gap. So as of today, what is required is that you study well, you understand the concepts well, you try to practice them as much as possible, revise them whenever possible. Don't learn them right away. It is a gradual process. As and soon when the time is passing, try to learn in installments, shorter parts. As of now, it would be quite heavy for you to attend the classes, then to read the material, then to learn it, then to revise it. Quite heavy exercises these are. Better to divide it in installments and part, and better to prepare a timeline, schedule a timeline. Yes, as of today, I'll be covering the syllabus, I'll be understanding all, each and everything. I'll practice the questions. Your brain too has primary memory and secondary memory. So when you try to understand the concept, practice everything, and you move on to next chapter or another subject, that particular work which you say that you are not able to retain, the brain actually retains it in your secondary memory. And at the time of revision or learning or at the time of exam, just a matter of 5 to 10 minutes or 15 minutes, the brain itself gets the signal that I have to shift. It opens your cache and it shifts the all what you have fed into your primary memory into secondary memory into your primary memory. Oh yes, I learned. I read about this. I had made notes on this. Slowly and gradually, you will start recalling. Don't panic at that time. I don't remember anything. This takes. It might happen in a fraction of seconds, or it might happen slowly and gradually. So that is the strategy and approach you need to follow. This fear is quite normal, not retaining, but you cannot help it. Your brain is the best machine, natural machine, the best. Keep working on it. Good diet, good exercise, and everything. You have to get time for practicing questions. That is why I told you don't learn, revise right away, but do practice whatever time you get, how much ever practice you can. At least so much of the practice of the questions that you are able to understand and grasp the concepts clearly. That is what is required. Any other doubts? No? Okay, fine. So we'll wind up today's session and meet you in one of your next chapters sometime, someday, as per your schedule. Okay? Take care till then. And if still have any doubts relating to your preparation or how to learn, how to write, we'll cover it. Bring them up. We'll cover it the next time I come. Take care till then. Wishing you all a good night. Take care. Bye bye.